Hi, survey students. Welcome back from spring break. Maybe it wasn't so much of a break for you. I'm going to do my best to keep these as mini lectures and give you some opportunities for study sessions, maybe not in every mini lecture, but in some of them for sure. So I sent you a link already to talk about the quiz. I want to remind you to keep taking notes, even though I won't see you again, and to collect your notebooks. I probably will have some other sort of assignment pertaining to that. And I wanted to remind you again that it's really important to kind of do that overlap of the transference of skills from what you read in your Revel text to what you hear in lecture, to what you observe yourself with the art. So we're going to mostly talk about 19th century, move into modernization today, similar to what you have seen in the video, the Cult of Progress that we watched before we left for the break. So with that as well, I want to remind you also that timelines are going to be done in your groups via Google presentations. So check Blackboard for the instructions on that as well. So terms are similar to what you might have already heard from the Civilizations Cult of Progress DVD, and similar to what you should be reading in Revel. We're going to talk about a couple different styles in the next couple mini lectures. Realism is the style we'll pretty much talk about today. And then the next mini lecture, we'll talk about Impressionism as a style. We've already talked a lot about academic art, the kind of Salon Academy, hierarchy of genres, neoclassicism, a very refined sort of art. You heard in the DVD about Orientalism and this kind of Western gaze onto non-Western peoples. That corresponds with colonization of non-Western peoples by the European powers of the 19th century. And of course, it also corresponds with industrialization, or colonialism corresponds with industrialization, and railroads and inventions like various factories, cotton gin, technologies like photography, of course. We're going to talk about all that. So these other terms, like a daguerreotype is an early form of a photograph, we'll see. And then next time when we talk about Impressionism, we'll talk about Japonisme, Divisionism, en plein air, and avant-garde. But those are really terms for next time. So as an opportunity for a study session, I posted a question on Discord. And if you use the hashtag Cult of Progress, you can respond what idea most stood out for you from the DVD Cult of Progress. But you need to do so by March 24. So industrialization is huge, right? And you can see the different railroads, how they connect to different city centers here around 1850, much less so in the United States. It's pretty much a new country. 1850, it's not even 100 years old. But we talked about when we were looking at some of the Romantic landscape painting, this movement of workers into the city for factory jobs, and how that really changed the makeup of the city, class dynamics particularly. And in 1848, indeed, there were many, many revolutions across Europe having to do with class. Also, during the 19th century, we're talking about new technologies, right? So trains moving those goods, steamships moving those goods, obviously better communication with telephones. Things go much faster. People were awed by all of these new inventions. The light bulb. Later on, in the early 20th century, motion pictures, as you can see, moving into the 20th century, wire telegraphy as well. So if we're talking about modernity, it's kind of important to understand how people in the 19th century considered modernity as well. And a commentator in France, Charles Baudelaire, discussed modernity as the transient, the fleeting, the contingent. So perhaps where we're at with this pandemic is the epitome of modern as well. We are living in a contingent age. Everything we do is contingent. And I think part of this pandemic, what we are seeing is that our illusion of stability is just more transparent now. We've always lived in a contingent world, but that illusion of stability is just ripped off. So industrialization is new in the 19th century, this movement to the cities, to urban centers. Capitalism, of course, we talked about its development in the Dutch Republic in the 17th century, but this becomes the major form of economic system within most European powers because of who is funding these factories and whatnot. New technologies, printmaking with lithography, photography, etc. Nationalism will play in a little bit, and we'll talk about that. Different nations wanting to expand their reach as empires, as building colonies. It certainly leads to the First and Second World Wars, that European expansion, which we will get into as we move into the 20th century. I mentioned already the movement of peoples into urban centers precipitated a lot of social unrest because of this disparity between rich and poor, the long working days. This is before labor unions, the exploitation of workers by those who had money and wealth. And so that's where you see increasing class consciousness on the part of artists, increasing criticism of the capitalist system within art, as well as worker revolutions throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century as well. So what we're experiencing now is nothing new. And I know I've said that before. The kind of understanding our history is really significant when you come to understanding social and economic unrest. So in terms of art, understanding different ways of seeing, and that they're, especially with the development of photography, that the role of painting becomes questioned in terms of representing a quote unquote reality. And as I mentioned, like, the idea that there is a single reality is itself questioned in modern philosophy. And so understanding even our own times, what is real, what is stable, that is an illusion. And the sooner we let that go, the sooner we actually can feel a little bit of peace, I think. So we'll see into the 20th century that abstraction comes to the fore, and we'll see a different understanding of the body and sexuality as well. I'm going to breeze through some of these slides about the Crystal Palace. There are many World's Fairs and exhibitions. This is a use of iron, a skeletal frame, new technology, glass over the iron, a kind of wow effect that wanted to showcase these colonial powers, technologies, and then inside the building, the different kinds of things, objects, peoples even, that this colonial power, in this case Britain, was bringing back to the metropole, bringing back to London. And so here's a photograph of that, so representing modernity both in the fact that it's a photograph as well as the iron as a skeletal frame for this glass over it, and then the hall itself as an exhibition center that attracted many, 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 many people to see all of these wonders of the colonization of the British Empire. These photographs as well, just showing this technology, these iron skeletons in themselves as photographs technology. So looking at photography too, it's really important to kind of understand how it developed concurrently in France and England with the calotype and daguerreotype, and then also its development in the United States with Eastman Kodak. So that's huge. The daguerreotype is a fixed wet plate, and you can only have a single impression. Please read in your text about what a daguerreotype is and how it is different than, say, regular wet plate photography with negatives. There is no negative with this. It is basically an impression that is frozen on to a plate. So it's really clunky, really difficult. And notice, because it takes so long to expose to the light, Daguerre first did still lifes, and you saw in the Cult of Progress when he took a street scene, people weren't captured because it took too long. Nader also here with a lithograph, another new technology in printmaking, showing this obsession of people with this new technology of photography. So again, you kind of have this interesting overlap of these new technologies and modernity. Different ways of considering composition arise with photography. So Talbot, thinking about how to create interesting shadows, plays of light, diagonals with the broom, verticals with the brick lines, and the different textures of the wooden door to the brick. These are all things where photography is becoming something for folks that can be an art form as composition is considered. Julia Margaret Cameron similarly considered composition. She picked up photography very late in her own life. Her children gave her a camera, and she takes portraits that almost seem like they are embodying a kind of, in this case, a literary figure, Ophelia. That's not who this person's name actually is, but is referencing rather a poem. And in contrast, Nader's portrait, very crisp, very sharp, very posed, of Eugene Delacroix, the artist. So kind of considering how each photographer is using the medium of photography to convey particular ideas or particular characteristics or personality traits. This is something we've seen already in painting. Different painters like Frans Hals or Jan van Eyck use different techniques to portray personality in portraiture. And so here we see it also in photography. Or in the United States, Timothy O'Sullivan or Alexander Gardner composed these scenes of battlefields during the Civil War. These are not realistic or real in the sense that it's documentary. It is projected as documentary. You might conceptualize it as such, but they are posed. On the left, the horizon line is super high, which gives us a sense of even more bodies, death on the field, and that's why it's called Harvest of Death. The one on the right is not really a sharpshooter. The rifle and the infantrymen are posed again, unfortunately, in death. But that is purposeful and a way of, again, manipulating this new art form as art. Edward Muybridge made many, many developments in photography as well as in understanding even science. People didn't understand how horses, when they galloped, had all 4 feet off the ground until he published his photograph books of animals and bodies in motion. Then we have painters like Thomas Eakins on the right, who is using this realistic, very refined brushstroke style to present the new science, the new kind of interest in looking at the world, looking at human bodies. So you have it both in photography, a capturing of a new surgical room, and in painting with Thomas Eakins here, an instructor in the surgery showing this surgery under ether. And can you imagine not having anesthesia? Ether was a very primitive form of anesthesia. Most people in the Civil War, if they had to have an amputation, just got a shot of brandy or whiskey. So I'm going to move us to talk about painting in France and realism as a style in France. Courbet is a really significant figure to think about when we're talking about realism in France. And he was very focused on addressing class dynamics in France around 1850. So again, there was a revolution across Europe, multiple revolutions in 1848. Marx had published his Communist Manifesto in 1848. Many people were thinking about the disparity between wealth and poor because of factories, because of this very visible situation. And so Courbet is seeking to capture that. He's quoted to have said, "I've never seen an angel. Show me an angel and I'll paint one." So his desire to present real life is part of what realism is about. So the Stonebreakers here, Courbet wanted to show the image of labor gone to waste, and men stiff-backed and wooden by routine over and over and over again, and even generational poverty in this way, where the old man is on the right and the younger boy who is going to have to follow in his footsteps. And the work that they're doing is backbreaking. Literally what they're doing is pounding up rock to create the gravel for roads. And these are the roads that would take people into the urban cities to work. So a commentator in France wrote about Corbeil's stone breakers, an irony of our industrial civilization, which continually invents wonderful machines to perform all kinds of labor, yet is unable to liberate humans from the most backbreaking toil. And Courbet, as I said, is committed to realism. He's committed to presenting these class dynamics. And he does so also in the burial at Ornans here. Ornans is a city, and he shows different classes, from clerics, the priests in the red and black robes at this burial scene, to mourners, more rural folks in mourning in the black, and the women covering their mouths, to those wealthier bourgeoisie on the left. This is monumental in scale, 10 feet high by 22 feet wide, and really was difficult for people to kind of understand at the time as a history painting. Again, it doesn't follow academic tradition in terms of some sort of exemplum virtutis or virtuous example or any sort of contemporary history. It's just a common burial. And that was really problematic for folks who believed in academic painting and the hierarchy of genres like history painting at the top. But by putting realism or putting this kind of mundane subject matter on this monumental scale, Courbet is trying to bring it into academic bourgeois sensibility. Jean-François Millet, also working in France, presents workers, in this case, gleaning the fields after harvest, literally picking up the last little pieces of wheat, the chaff, the last shards. And this kind of bourgeois myth of rural society, the idea that laborers in rural parts of the country like the labor that they're doing. I think you could read it that way, but I think really this is again a commentary on class. And already I've read that quote from Proudhon about the backbreaking toil. A contemporary African-American artist, Hank Thomas Willis, has used contemporary sports and reference to 19th century class dynamics in painting to also discuss class and race in contemporary sports. So the idea that particularly African-American athletes become slaves to their contracts is referenced in the cotton picking here, and of course the quarterback or whoever there. We've already seen Rue Trans-Monin. We talked about it in the quiz, so I'm going to move through this. But suffice it to say, remember, this is a picture of a death scene, right? A worker having been killed by police. So again, class dynamics are key to understanding Daumier. Hank Willis Thomas also has referenced early photographs in his contemporary work here, like I Am a Man, not I Am 3/5 of a Man, referencing early American Plessy versus Ferguson, or voting, 3/5 for voting in population censuses in the 19th century. And then of course, Hands Up, Don't Shoot is referenced in the bottom. Ilya Repin is a Russian realist. So again, you see the toil of the underclass, the proletariat, the workers, literally pulling a barge around on the River Volga. And this is, you know, representing humanity and the toil of humanity in a realistic way. Rosa Bonheur does not, she's a female artist in France, does not represent workers so much as animals, but also on a monumental scale. And she was very well known for her animal paintings, monumental sized animal paintings in her lifetime. She worked both in the United States and in France. She was raised in a fairly egalitarian household, and so was trained by her dad and learned how to paint early on. And I think if you want, you can see how Wayne Thiebaud is influenced, a contemporary artist is influenced by Rosa Bonheur, if you want to follow that link, that would be interesting for you. So that's my lecture, my mini lecture for today. On Thursday, I'll have an activity for you guys that can count as a study session again as we talk about Impressionism. Have a wonderful break. I will try to upload most videos on Mondays and Wednesdays, and I hope that you stay well and stay safe.